A megatrend is something that is a long-term structural shift that's transforming economies. So there's a few ways you can identify a megatrend. So it has to be a long-term structural shift. It's going to transform economies. It has to be in an area of high innovation and disruption. And it has to also, and I think it's really important, have to have government support, and it has to be intertwined with demographics. Because that word megatrend, it gets, thrown around a lot, megatrends, and, it's a bit of a buzzword. And I think investors need to be aware that a megatrend is long-term. It's in areas of, whether it's transformative technology. So the car and the inception of the automobile is an example of a megatrend. What we sometimes find is people need to take a step back and sort of analyze, well, is this a megatrend, or is this just a fad? And, luckily here in Australia, in terms of an ETF world, we don't have many exposures in the ETF sense that have exposures to fads. Most of the ETFs that we have that are looking at thematics are very much looking at megatrends, which is long-term in nature. What we try to do is try to understand, well, how do you identify megatrends? So we talked about, their long-term structural transformative underlying themes. They're in areas of high innovation and disruption. They've got government support. And we put that into 4 buckets. So when you consider transformative technology, now that is quite broad, but it includes things like the fact that we can do something like this interview in lockdowns at the moment. We can do it virtually. It's society and lifestyle. And again, that could look at things like the connected world that we live in through social media, or it could look at emerging markets. They say there's an interesting stat that often gets thrown around, which is in Japan, they sell more adult diapers than they do baby diapers. And the example there is of that aging population in developed markets. But then the flip side of that is an emerging market consumer opportunity. The consumption story that you have in India, for example, nearly 500 million people make up their middle class. You then look at health and wellness. And this is an interesting area in itself. COVID put a bit of a spotlight on health and wellness as a megatrend, as a broad megatrend. But within this space, it's more than just COVID. Whether it's looking at alternative medicines, whether it's looking at biotechnology, so the development and research in vaccines and other treatments beyond COVID in particular, that's an area in itself. And then finally, you have environment and resources. And again, the whole concept and the idea of clean energy and clean technology really is an area that's only going to continue to grow. Megatrends need to be an important consideration for investors, because what we've actually found, and a lot of it is driven by younger investors as well. They want to align their portfolios to their views and values. And that can sometimes be difficult to do when they've only been presented with broad market indexes or broad market ETFs or very broad exposures. So thematic ETFs give them the ability to take a view on an underlying megatrend, whether that be, biotechnology or robotics and automation or cybersecurity or esports or whatever it may be. They have an ability now to take this view on a theme. The other thing is the overlap. So to a lot of investors, let's look at we've got an ETF that focuses on the technology sector. So I sometimes talk about it in terms of it looks at deep technology. So companies that are involved in the hardware, the software area of this technology sector. So companies like, Microsoft and IBM, etc. Now, this particular ETF looks at the technology sector. And then people will say, well, the NASDAQ 100 index is the technology index. But the overlap between a pure play tech sector ETF and the NASDAQ 100 index is roughly around 17%. So that overlap. So similar, some similar companies, but there's not a complete overlap. So what you find is when you're investing in some of these broad market indexes, you're getting exposure to other areas. Now, if you're comfortable with that, that is fine. But as long as people are aware that if you want exposure to a pure megatrend, whatever that may be, a thematic ETF provides you the ability to get that exposure versus having to be one part of that area. So the ETFs capture megatrends through the tracking of the indexes that they license. So to sort of take a step back, an ETF tracks a benchmark. Now, a benchmark can be a basket of stocks. So for thematic ETFs, generally we're talking about equity ETFs. Now, these benchmarks, when ETF Securities, for example, we have a range of thematic ETFs, we're looking to broaden out this range. And when we're developing our products, we want to make sure that we're licensing an index, or we track an index or a benchmark that truly reflects that particular thematic that we want to give investors exposure to. You need to really sort of drill down a little bit when you're talking about thematic ETFs. So, the sort of age-old saying of, lift up the bonnet or lift up the hood of the ETF. And that's really true, because there are some ETFs that may have, talking about robotics, you may have two ETFs with robotics in the name, but are they truly pure play? Because that is really important. Is the portfolio, the underlying portfolio, true to label? So this particular ETF in Robo, it really is true to label. And when you look at the portfolio, you've got companies such as iRobot. iRobot produces the robotic vacuum cleaners that we have, that consumers have around their houses. Now, that is a big area of growth in terms of robotics, artificial intelligence, and automation. Or food and agriculture, John Deere, a company that fits into that Robo index. Again, it's a tractor company, but most of the tractors that are being sold by John Deere are using some form of AI software or autonomous driving. So again, it is more than just, the technology companies. And I think sometimes people need to understand, thinking about some of these thematics, they need to be sector agnostic, and sometimes they need to be country agnostic, because you can't just have a lens on Australia. When you talk about Australia and these themes, you're very limited in your choice. So you need to be broader than that. Because again, when they consider a thematic, they need to make sure that that thematic has some form of country agnostic view within that construction. So you don't want to be locked into a particular country. And I say that because themes are country agnostic. You've got companies around the world that are innovating in particular themes. So let's take the ACDC, which is our battery tech ETF. It looks at the thematic of battery technology and lithium. It's had a lot of interest of late because of that government support that we've seen over the past 2-3 years, whether it's been from the UK, from Europe, from China, and even more recently, the US, and a little bit from Australia more recently. But what you found is when you take the country exposures, it's not just the US. There's nearly 35 companies in that portfolio, and you get exposed to South Korea, Japan, Europe, US, Australia, all developed markets. I think the one that I wanted to, a really good ETF to explore to really capitalize the megatrend space, is the Robo ETF. So ROBO is the code. It's our robotics, automation, and artificial intelligence ETF. So when you think about that megatrend of robotics and automation and AI, as I said, it's more than technology. It has this team behind it. And in a lot of ways, it's like an active fund. It has a research team. It has a board of strategic advisors. So the strategic advisors are entrepreneurs, they're industry experts. Daniela Rus is a strategic advisor for Robo Global. She heads up MIT's Center of Robotics. So the highest in terms of academia within the robotics and automation and AI space are supporting this index. And they're supporting the index by helping them define this theme. When they launched this index in 2013, there was no index available that gave you a pure play exposure to this thematic. And so they had to create it off their own back. So one, they have to define what is this megatrend. Then they have to define the subsectors within that, whether it's sensing, actuation, or whether it's 3D printing is a really good example. And then within 3D printing, well, is it commercial 3D printing? Is it consumer, your at-home 3D printing? And then within that even further, which companies should they look at?